When Kevin first boarded that plane, he was just another passenger looking forward to a routine flight. But little did he know, this journey would test his character and reveal more than just the destination ahead. As he took his seat, Kevin couldn't help but notice the cold stares from the flight crew, particularly Sarah, a flight attendant whose dismissive attitude made it clear that he wasn't welcome. What seemed like subtle indifference at first soon escalated into blatant disrespect, all because of the color of his skin. But what no one on that plane realized was that Kevin was more than just a passenger. And as the truth about Kevin's abilities unfolded, it wasn't just Sarah who was left stunned. It set off a chain reaction that would change the lives of everyone involved. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're ready to witness this inspiring journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The bustling airport terminal hummed with activity as travelers rushed to their gates, dragging suitcases and clutching boarding passes. Among the sea of faces, Kevin stood out, a tall, well-dressed black man in his early 40s. His confident stride and relaxed demeanor set him apart from the frantic energy around him. As he approached the first-class line, Kevin adjusted his grip on his leather carry-on. The bag shifted, revealing a glimpse of a worn pilot's license tucked into a side pocket. He took a deep breath, savoring the familiar scent of jet fuel and coffee that permeated the air. At the front of the line stood Sarah, a flight attendant with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a pristine uniform. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted Kevin, her lips pursing into a thin line. As he stepped forward, her gaze raked over him, lingering on his expensive watch and tailored suit. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said, emphasizing the word sir with a hint of sarcasm. "Are you sure you're in the right line? Economy boarding is over there." She gestured vaguely behind her, a smug smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Kevin met her gaze steadily, his expression neutral. Without a word, he held out his boarding pass. Sarah snatched it from his hand, her manicured nails clicking against the paper as she scanned it. Her eyes widened briefly before her face settled into a scowl. "I see," she said curtly, thrusting the pass back at him. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Johnson." As Kevin moved past her, he heard her mutter under her breath, "I guess they're letting anyone fly first class these days." He paused for a moment, his shoulders tensing. Then, with a barely perceptible shake of his head, he continued down the jet bridge. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a response. Behind him, a group of flight attendants huddled near the gate desk, watching the interaction unfold. A young man with kind eyes frowned, leaning towards his colleague. "Did you see that?" Sarah's way out of line. The woman beside him shrugged, her eyes darting nervously towards Sarah. "It's not our place to say anything," she whispered. "You know how she can be." A few feet away, two male attendants exchanged knowing glances, poorly concealing their amusement. One of them snickered, quickly covering it with a cough when Sarah looked their way. As Kevin entered the plane, the familiar sense of belonging washed over him. He'd spent countless hours in cockpits just like the one beyond the locked door at the front of the cabin. For a moment, he was tempted to mention his experience, to put Sarah and the others in their place. But he pushed the thought aside. He was here to relax, not to prove himself to strangers. He found his seat easily, stowing his bag in the overhead compartment before settling in. The plush leather embraced him as he leaned back, closing his eyes and letting out a long breath. He could feel curious glances from other passengers, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the low hum of the engines as they prepared for takeoff. As the flight settled into its cruise, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin crew began their in-flight service. Sarah emerged from the galley, pushing a cart laden with drinks and snacks. Her demeanor was bright and cheerful as she approached the first row of first-class passengers, a stark contrast to her earlier behavior. "Good afternoon. What can I get for you today?" Sarah's voice was honeyed as she addressed an elderly couple seated across the aisle from Kevin. She leaned in, listening attentively to their requests, nodding and smiling as she poured their drinks with careful precision. Kevin watched the interaction from the corner of his eye, his face impassive. He knew what was coming, but he steeled himself, determined not to let Sarah's attitude affect him. As Sarah approached his row, her smile vanished, replaced by a look of barely concealed disdain. Without a word, she placed a napkin on Kevin's tray table, followed by a plastic cup of water. The movement was so abrupt that some of the water sloshed over the rim, leaving small droplets on the tray. "Thank you," Kevin said politely, reaching for the cup. Sarah's only response was a derisive snort as she turned away, moving on to the next passenger without even making eye contact. From further down the aisle, Alex, the younger flight attendant Kevin had noticed earlier, watched the interaction with a furrowed brow. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if considering whether to say something, but ultimately turned back to his own tasks, throwing an apologetic glance in Kevin's direction. As the service continued, the tension in the first-class cabin became palpable. Sarah's voice carried clearly as she chatted amiably with other passengers, her tone warm and engaging. The contrast with her curt, almost hostile treatment of Kevin was impossible to ignore. An elderly woman a few rows behind Kevin leaned towards her husband, whispering, "Did you see that? The way she treated that gentleman? It's shameful." Her husband nodded, his expression troubled. "It's not right. Someone ought to say something." A businessman seated near the front of the cabin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pointedly focusing on his laptop screen. He'd noticed Sarah's behavior, but seemed determined to stay out of it, perhaps not wanting to get involved in a potentially messy situation. As Sarah made her way back up the aisle, refilling drinks and offering additional snacks, she paused by a well-dressed woman in her 50s. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" she asked, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. The woman glanced at Kevin, then back at Sarah, her expression conflicted. "No, thank you," she said quietly, averting her eyes. Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice, but not quite enough to prevent her words from carrying. "I didn't realize they were handing out first-class seats in charity raffles now," she said with a smirk, nodding subtly in Kevin's direction. The woman's eyes widened in shock, but before she could respond, Sarah had already moved on, leaving a wake of uncomfortable silence behind her. Kevin, who had been taking a sip of his water, nearly choked at Sarah's words. He set the cup down carefully, his jaw clenching almost imperceptibly as he struggled to maintain his composure. He'd faced discrimination before, but rarely so blatant, and certainly never at 35,000 feet with nowhere to go. For a moment, he considered confronting Sarah, calling out her behavior for what it was: pure, unadulterated racism. But as quickly as the thought came, he dismissed it. He knew from experience that engaging with such ignorance rarely led anywhere productive. Instead, he took a deep breath, focusing on the steady hum of the engines, using the familiar sound to center himself. Unbeknownst to Sarah, her comment had not gone unnoticed by others in the cabin. A young woman seated near the front pulled out her phone, angling it discreetly to capture Sarah's movements on video. Her fingers flew across the screen, likely posting about the incident on social media. The elderly couple who had noticed Sarah's behavior earlier now looked openly disapproving. The woman shook her head, muttering to her husband, "In this day and age, I can't believe people still act like this. It's disgraceful." Even Alex, who had been trying to stay out of the situation, couldn't hide his discomfort any longer. As he passed Kevin's seat, he paused, leaning in slightly. "I'm so sorry about this, sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is there anything I can get for you?" Kevin appreciated the young man's gesture, but he knew it wasn't Alex's responsibility to make up for Sarah's behavior. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied quietly, offering a small smile of reassurance. As Alex moved away, the cockpit door opened and the co-pilot stepped out, likely for a quick bathroom break. He paused near the galley, his eyes scanning the cabin as Sarah approached. "Everything all right out here?" the co-pilot asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Sarah's demeanor changed instantly, her face morphing into a mask of professional courtesy. "Everything's fine, sir," she replied smoothly. "Just finishing up the drink service?" The co-pilot nodded, but his gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer, a hint of warning in his eyes. He'd clearly overheard something of what had been happening, but like Alex, he seemed hesitant to intervene directly. Instead, he disappeared into the lavatory, leaving Sarah to continue her duties. As the tension in the cabin continued to simmer, Kevin found his thoughts drifting. His hand moved almost unconsciously to his carry-on bag, tucked neatly under the seat in front of him. Inside, he knew, was his pilot's license, a small, laminated card that represented years of hard work, dedication, and sacrifice. He closed his eyes, memories washing over him. Long nights of study, countless hours in simulators, the nerves and exhilaration of his first solo flight. He remembered the pride he'd felt when he'd earned his commercial license, the sense of achievement when he'd been hired by his first airline. Kevin had faced obstacles at every step of his career. There were those who doubted him, who'd suggested, sometimes subtly, sometimes not, that he didn't belong in the cockpit. But he'd persevered, driven by a passion for flying and a determination to prove his doubters wrong. Opening his eyes, Kevin glanced around the cabin. He saw the looks of discomfort on some passengers' faces, the barely concealed curiosity on others. He saw Sarah, still moving through the aisle, her actions speaking louder than words about her prejudices. In that moment, Kevin made a decision. He wouldn't let Sarah's ignorance diminish him. He was more than her narrow-minded assumptions, more than the color of his skin. He was a skilled pilot, a professional, a man who had earned his place in this first-class cabin through hard work and dedication. As if sensing his renewed resolve, Sarah approached Kevin's seat once more, a forced smile on her face. "More water?" she asked, her tone clipped. Kevin met her gaze steadily. "Yes, please," he replied, his voice calm and measured. "Thank you, Sarah." A flicker of surprise crossed Sarah's face at his use of her name, quickly replaced by a scowl. She refilled his water without a word, then moved on, her back stiff with poorly concealed anger. The incident seemed to have emboldened some of the other passengers. The elderly woman who had been whispering to her husband earlier caught Kevin's eye, offering him a sympathetic smile. The young woman with the phone had put it away, but she was now watching Sarah's movements with narrowed eyes, as if daring her to say something else inappropriate. Even the businessman who had been studiously ignoring the situation glanced up from his laptop, his expression a mixture of guilt and concern. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, returning to his work with a troubled frown. As the flight progressed, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained tense. Sarah continued her duties, but her movements were stiff, her interactions with passengers minimal. It was clear that she knew her behavior had been noticed, but rather than moderating her actions, she seemed to have retreated into a sullen silence. Alex, meanwhile, had taken it upon himself to provide extra attention to Kevin's needs. He appeared periodically, offering refills or snacks with a friendly smile, as if trying to make up for his colleague's behavior. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Alex asked during one such visit, his voice low. "Perhaps a magazine or a pair of headphones?" Kevin appreciated the young man's efforts. "I'm fine, thank you, Alex," he replied warmly. "I appreciate your attentiveness." Alex nodded, a hint of relief in his eyes. "Of course, sir. Please don't hesitate to ask if you need anything at all." As Alex moved away, Kevin caught Sarah watching the interaction, her eyes narrowed. She turned away quickly when she realized Kevin had noticed, busying herself with reorganizing the drink cart. The co-pilot emerged from the cockpit once more, this time for what appeared to be a routine check of the cabin. As he made his way down the aisle, nodding to passengers, his gaze lingered on Sarah. She straightened under his scrutiny, her face a mask of professionalism. "Everything going smoothly?" the co-pilot asked as he reached her. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice overly bright. "No issues at all." The co-pilot's eyes flicked briefly to Kevin, then back to Sarah. "Glad to hear it," he said, his tone neutral, but his meaning clear. "Keep up the good work." As the co-pilot returned to the cockpit, Kevin couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was grateful that others had noticed Sarah's behavior and seemed disapproving of it. On the other, he was frustrated that no one, not even those in positions of authority, had directly addressed the issue. It was a familiar feeling, one he'd encountered many times throughout his career. The silent bystanders, the subtle nods of sympathy, the quiet disapproval that never quite translated into action. It was exhausting, always being the one expected to rise above, to be the bigger person. The calm of the flight was suddenly shattered as the plane lurched violently, caught in an unexpected patch of turbulence. Passengers gasped, gripping their armrests tightly as the aircraft shuddered and swayed. Overhead compartments rattled ominously, and the sound of items shifting filled the cabin. Kevin instinctively tightened his seatbelt, his pilot's instincts kicking in as he assessed the situation. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. Something felt off. His suspicions were confirmed moments later when a tense voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We're experiencing a minor issue in the cockpit. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation." The announcement did little to calm the rising panic in the cabin. Worried murmurs rippled through the passengers as they exchanged nervous glances. Kevin's brow furrowed as he picked up on the strain in the co-pilot's voice. Years of experience told him that this was more than just a minor issue. His suspicions were confirmed when he noticed a flight attendant, her face pale with worry, rushing towards the first-class galley. She huddled close to Sarah and Alex, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. But in the tense quiet of the cabin, her whispers carried to Kevin's alert ears. "The pilot's collapsed," she hissed, her voice trembling. "He's completely unresponsive. The co-pilot is trying to handle everything alone, but he's overwhelmed. We need to land as soon as possible, but with this turbulence..." Sarah's eyes widened in shock, while Alex's face drained of color. The gravity of the situation hit them like a physical blow. Kevin felt his heart rate quicken, not from fear, but from the sudden surge of adrenaline. This was a crisis, and he knew he could help. Without hesitation, Kevin unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his movements smooth and purposeful. He approached the group of flight attendants, who were still huddled in frantic discussion. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm a pilot. I have experience in handling emergencies like this. Let me help." The flight attendants turned to him, a mix of surprise and skepticism on their faces. Sarah, in particular, looked at him with open disbelief. "You," she scoffed, her earlier disdain bubbling to the surface despite the dire circumstances. "A pilot? We're not taking any risks with amateurs. This is a real emergency." Kevin met her gaze steadily, unfazed by her hostility. "I assure you, I'm no amateur. I've been flying commercial aircraft for over a decade. Every moment we waste here puts everyone on this plane at greater risk." The urgency in his voice seemed to penetrate Sarah's skepticism. Around them, passengers who had overheard the exchange began to murmur, some calling out in support of Kevin. "Let him help. If he's a pilot, what are you waiting for? Do something before we all die." The rising panic in the cabin seemed to sway Sarah. She hesitated, looking torn between her prejudice and the clear need for assistance. Alex, however, didn't wait for her decision. He rushed to the intercom, his voice shaky as he called the cockpit. "Co-pilot, this is Alex from the cabin crew. We have a passenger who says he's an experienced pilot. Should we send him up?" There was a moment of tense silence before the co-pilot's voice crackled through, strained and desperate. "If anyone on board has flight experience, we could really use some assistance up here. Send them immediately." That was all Alex needed to hear. He turned to Kevin, hope shining in his eyes. "Sir, please follow me." As Alex led Kevin towards the cockpit, Sarah trailed behind, her face a mix of emotions, anger, fear, and a growing sense of uncertainty. The passengers watched in tense silence as Kevin was ushered to the front of the plane, many offering words of encouragement as he passed. "Good luck. We're counting on you." "God bless you, sir." Kevin nodded acknowledgement, his focus already on the task ahead. As they reached the cockpit door, Alex keyed in the security code with trembling fingers. The door swung open, revealing a scene of barely controlled chaos. The co-pilot looked up as they entered, relief washing over his sweat-streaked face. The captain lay slumped in his seat, unconscious, while warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. The plane shuddered again, caught in another wave of turbulence. "Thank God," the co-pilot breathed. "Are you the pilot?" Kevin nodded, already moving towards the empty seat. "Kevin Johnson, commercial pilot with 12 years of experience. What's our situation?" As Kevin settled into the co-pilot seat, The younger man quickly briefed him on their predicament. The captain had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack mid-flight. The co-pilot had been struggling to navigate through unexpected turbulence while also trying to plot an emergency landing. Kevin listened intently, his hands already moving across the controls with practiced ease. He quickly assessed their position, fuel levels, and the weather conditions. "All right," he said, his voice steady and confident. "First things first, let's stabilize our flight path and get out of this turbulence. Then we'll contact air traffic control and arrange for an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport." The co-pilot nodded gratefully, visibly relaxing as Kevin took charge of the situation. Behind them, Sarah and Alex watched from the doorway, their earlier skepticism replaced by awe as they observed Kevin's calm efficiency. Kevin's fingers danced across the instrument panel, making minute adjustments to their heading and altitude. His eyes darted between the various displays, processing information with lightning speed. When he spoke into the radio, his voice was clear and authoritative. "This is Flight 237 declaring an emergency. We have an incapacitated pilot and are requesting immediate clearance for an emergency landing. Current position is..." As Kevin relayed their coordinates and situation to air traffic control, the co-pilot stared at him in amazement. The man who had been dismissed and disrespected in the cabin was now their best hope for survival. Back in the cabin, word had spread quickly about the pilot's collapse and Kevin stepping in to help. The passengers alternated between tense silence and hushed prayers, their eyes fixed on the cockpit door as if willing it to open with good news. In the galley, the other flight attendants huddled around Sarah and Alex, peppering them with questions. "Is it true? Is he really a pilot? How's he doing up there? Are we going to be okay?" Sarah found herself at a loss for words. The confidence and skill she had just witnessed left her previous assumptions in tatters. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Alex, sensing her discomfort, stepped in. "He seems to know exactly what he's doing." The co-pilot looked relieved as soon as he took over. As if to confirm his words, the plane's shuddering gradually subsided. The patches of turbulence became less frequent, and soon the flight smoothed out entirely. A collective sigh of relief went through the cabin. In the cockpit, Kevin worked in perfect sync with the co-pilot, their movements choreographed as if they'd flown together for years. Kevin's calm demeanor seemed to infect the younger man, who had regained his composure and was now functioning with renewed confidence. "Air traffic control has cleared us for an emergency landing at Newark Liberty International," Kevin announced. "We'll be on the ground in approximately 25 minutes. Let's start our descent." As Kevin guided the plane into a gentle descent, he turned to the co-pilot. "Can you brief the cabin crew? They need to prepare the passengers for an emergency landing." The co-pilot nodded and reached for the intercom. His voice, steady now, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. Due to a medical emergency, we will be making an unscheduled landing at Newark Liberty International Airport in approximately 25 minutes. Our guest pilot and I have the situation under control. However, as a precaution, we ask that you follow all instructions from the cabin crew for an emergency landing procedure. Thank you for your cooperation." In the cabin, the announcement was met with a mix of relief and apprehension. The flight attendants sprang into action, moving through the aisles to secure loose items and instruct passengers on the brace position. Sarah found herself moving on autopilot, her mind still reeling from the rapid turn of events. As she demonstrated the brace position to a nervous elderly couple, she couldn't help but glance towards the cockpit. The man she had dismissed and insulted was now the one holding all their lives in his hands. Back in the cockpit, Kevin was fully in his element. His hands moved confidently over the controls as he guided the aircraft through its descent. He kept up a steady stream of communication with air traffic control, his voice calm and professional. "Newark Tower, this is Flight 237 on final approach. We have visual contact with the runway. Emergency vehicles standing by." "Affirmative, Flight 237. Emergency vehicles are in position. You are cleared to land on runway 4R. Winds are 10 knots from the northeast." "Roger that, Newark Tower. Beginning final approach now." As the plane descended through the clouds, the lights of Newark came into view. Kevin felt a familiar surge of focus, the kind that always came during critical moments of flight. He was acutely aware of every vibration of the aircraft, every minute change in its attitude. Beside him, the co-pilot watched in awe as Kevin guided the plane with seemingly effortless precision. Despite the unconventional circumstances, it was one of the smoothest approaches he had ever experienced. "Gear down," Kevin commanded, and the co-pilot complied immediately. The whine of hydraulics filled the cockpit as the landing gear deployed. 500 feet, the co-pilot called out, reading from the altimeter. 400, 300. Kevin's focus narrowed to the rapidly approaching runway. His hands made tiny adjustments to the yoke, compensating for a slight crosswind. 150, 40, 30, 20. With a gentle bump, the wheels touched down on the runway. Kevin immediately deployed the spoilers and engaged the thrust reversers. The roar of the engines filled the cabin as the plane decelerated rapidly. For a moment, there was silence, as if the passengers were holding their breath, unable to believe they were safely on the ground. Then, as the realization sank in, the cabin erupted in thunderous applause and cheers. Kevin guided the plane to its designated gate with the same calm precision he had demonstrated throughout the crisis. As the aircraft came to a stop, he let out a long breath, feeling the tension of the past hour begin to ebb away. Beside him, the co-pilot was shaking his head in disbelief and admiration. "I can't believe it," the young man said, his voice trembling slightly. "You saved us all. I've never seen flying like that, especially under these conditions." Kevin turned to him with a modest smile. "We did it together," he replied. "You kept your cool when it mattered most. That's what being a good pilot is all about." The co-pilot reached out his hand, and Kevin shook it firmly. "Thank you," the co-pilot said earnestly. "I don't even want to think about what might have happened if you hadn't been on board." Emergency crew started arriving immediately to take the unconscious pilot away. As they completed the shutdown procedures, Kevin could hear the continued applause and excited chatter from the cabin. He knew he would have to face the passengers soon, and while part of him wanted to slip away quietly, he understood the importance of this moment. When they finally opened the cockpit door, they were met with a sea of grateful faces. Passengers were standing in the aisles, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man who had saved their lives. As Kevin stepped into view, the applause grew even louder. Amidst the crowd, Kevin spotted Sarah. The flight attendant who had treated him with such disdain earlier was now pale and visibly shaken. As their eyes met, Sarah seemed to shrink into herself, clearly struggling with the weight of her earlier behavior. Slowly, Sarah made her way towards Kevin. The other passengers parted to let her through, many watching the interaction with keen interest. When she reached him, Sarah's usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. She opened her mouth to speak, closed it again, then finally managed to stammer out a few words. I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way I treated you earlier, it was unacceptable. I made assumptions and I was wrong. So wrong." Kevin regarded her calmly, noting the mix of shame and fear in her eyes. He could see she was struggling, torn between genuine remorse and the instinct to protect herself. "Thank you for your apology, Sarah," Kevin replied, his voice steady and measured. "I accept it, but I hope you understand that this goes beyond just me. The way you behaved reflects a broader issue that affects many people every day." Sarah nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Kevin continued, his words meant not just for her, but for everyone listening. "It's crucial that we learn to judge people by their abilities and character, not by their appearance or our preconceptions. Today showed why that's so important. In a crisis, it doesn't matter what someone looks like or where they come from. What matters is their skills, their experience, and their willingness to step up when needed." The cabin was silent as Kevin spoke, passengers and crew alike hanging on his every word. Sarah looked as if she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her, but she managed a small nod of acknowledgement. As the passengers began to disembark, word of the dramatic events had clearly spread. A group of airline officials was waiting on the jet bridge, led by a distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit who Kevin assumed was a senior manager. The man stepped forward as Kevin emerged from the aircraft, hand extended. Mr. Johnson, he said, his voice filled with gratitude and respect. I'm David Martinez, Senior Operations Manager for the airline. On behalf of everyone at the company, I want to thank you for your extraordinary actions today. You saved not only the lives of everyone on board, but also prevented what could have been a catastrophic incident for our airline. Kevin shook the manager's hand firmly. I'm just glad I was able to help, he replied modestly. The co-pilot and the rest of the crew also deserve credit for how they handled the situation. As they spoke, Kevin noticed several passengers approaching Mr. Martinez. Among them was the young woman who had been filming earlier, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The elderly couple who had been seated near Kevin also stepped forward, along with the businessman who had seemed so uncomfortable during the flight. "Excuse me, sir," the young woman said to Mr. Martinez. "I think there's something you need to see." She held out her phone, and Kevin could see a video playing on the screen. From the manager's darkening expression, it was clear the video captured Sarah's earlier behavior. The elderly woman chimed in, her voice quavering with emotion. The way that flight attendant treated this gentleman was disgraceful. If it hadn't been for him, who knows what would have happened to us all? The businessman nodded in agreement. "I've never witnessed such unprofessional conduct from a crew member," he added. It was blatant discrimination, plain and simple. Mr. Martinez listened to each complaint, his expression growing more serious by the moment. He glanced at Sarah, who was standing off to the side, her face ashen. "I see," he said gravely. "Thank you all for bringing this to my attention. I assure you, we take these matters very seriously." Turning to Sarah, Mr. Martinez's voice was stern. "Sarah, I need to speak with you immediately." He gestured for her to follow him a short distance away, where they could speak privately. Kevin couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see Sarah's body language change as Mr. Martinez spoke. Her shoulders slumped, and she seemed to shrink into herself. After a few moments, Sarah nodded dejectedly, and Mr. Martinez signaled to another airline employee. "Please escort Sarah to the office," he instructed. "We'll need to process her termination paperwork immediately." As Sarah was led away, her face pale and eyes brimming with tears, the other flight attendants watched in a mixture of shock and apprehension. Alex, the young attendant who had been kind to Kevin, looked particularly shaken. "I should have said something earlier," Alex murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I was afraid to speak up." Kevin overheard and placed a comforting hand on Alex's shoulder. "The important thing is to learn from this," he said gently. "Moving forward, we all have a responsibility to stand up against discrimination when we see it." As the commotion began to die down, Kevin found himself surrounded by grateful passengers. They shook his hand, patted him on the back, and expressed their heartfelt thanks. An older man with tears in his eyes gripped Kevin's hand tightly. "My granddaughter was waiting for me," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thanks to you, I'll get to see her grow up." A young mother approached with her child in tow. "You're a real-life superhero," she said, smiling warmly. "My son hasn't stopped talking about how cool it was to have a pilot save the day." The little boy looked up at Kevin with wide, awe-filled eyes. "When I grow up, I want to be just like you," he exclaimed. Kevin knelt down to the boy's level, his heart warmed by the child's words. "You can be anything you want to be," he said earnestly. "Just remember, it's not about what you look like or where you come from. It's about working hard, being kind, and always doing your best." As the crowd around him began to disperse, Kevin found himself left with a moment of quiet reflection. He turned to look back at the aircraft that had been the stage for such a dramatic sequence of events. It stood there on the tarmac, a silent testament to the power of skill, courage, and the triumph of character over prejudice. In that moment, Kevin felt the weight of what had transpired. His actions hadn't just changed the course of a flight. They had challenged deeply held biases and opened eyes. He hoped that the passengers and crew would carry this experience with them, that it might make them think twice before making judgments based on appearance. Mr. Martinez approached Kevin once more. "Mr. Johnson, we owe you a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid," he said solemnly. "Is there anything we can do for you? A first-class upgrade for your next flight, perhaps? Or maybe a meeting with our CEO?" Kevin shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. Thank you, but that's not necessary. If you really want to do something, consider using this incident as a catalyst for change within your organization. Implement stronger diversity and inclusion training. Make it clear that discrimination of any kind won't be tolerated. Mr. Martinez nodded, looking both chastened and inspired. You're absolutely right. I give you my word that we'll make this a priority. As Kevin prepared to leave, he took one last look around. The terminal was still abuzz with activity, but there was a different energy now. He could see people talking animatedly, no doubt recounting the events of the flight. But more importantly, he saw people looking at each other differently, with more openness, more consideration. He thought about Sarah, and while he felt no joy in her downfall, he hoped that this experience would lead her to confront her own biases and grow from them. He thought about Alex and the other flight attendants, and he hoped they would find the courage to stand up against injustice in the future. Most of all, he thought about all the people who had witnessed what happened today. He hoped that the next time they saw someone who looked different from them, they might remember this flight and think twice before making assumptions. As Kevin walked towards the exit, his pilot's license secure in his pocket, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had faced discrimination and prejudice, but he had also shown the power of competence, courage, and character. In doing so, he had not only saved lives but had also, perhaps, changed some hearts and minds. The automatic doors slid open, and Kevin stepped out into the cool night air. Behind him, the airport continued its ceaseless rhythm of arrivals and departures. But for Kevin, this wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something new, a reminder of the impact one person can have when they rise above prejudice and show the world what they're truly capable of. As he hailed a taxi, Kevin allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, he was content in the knowledge that today he had not only been a pilot but also a catalyst for change. And in the end, that was the most important journey of all. As Kevin settled into the back seat of the taxi, the events of the day began to replay in his mind. The driver, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" he asked. Kevin gave him the address of his hotel, then leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He was exhausted, the adrenaline from the emergency landing finally wearing off. "Rough day?" the driver inquired, noting Kevin's weary expression. Kevin chuckled softly. "You could say that," he replied, not feeling the need to elaborate. As the taxi merged into the late-night traffic, Kevin's phone buzzed. He pulled it out to find a flurry of notifications, missed calls, text messages, and social media alerts. Frowning, he opened his Twitter app and was stunned to see his name trending. The video of Sarah's discriminatory behavior, followed by Kevin's heroic actions, had gone viral. Thousands of people were sharing the story, praising Kevin's skill and bravery while condemning the airline's initial treatment of him. Kevin scrolled through the comments, a mix of emotions washing over him. While he was touched by the outpouring of support, he also felt a twinge of unease at the sudden attention. He had never sought the spotlight, preferring to let his work speak for itself. One tweet, in particular, caught his eye. It was from a prominent civil rights activist. Kevin Johnson's story is a powerful reminder of the ongoing battle against racial prejudice. His courage and competence in the face of discrimination should inspire us all to do better. #FlyWithoutBias. As Kevin pondered the implications of his newfound visibility, his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his wife, Lisa. "Kevin? Oh, thank God you're okay." Lisa's voice was thick with emotion. "I just saw the news. Why didn't you call me?" "I'm sorry, honey," Kevin said softly, feeling a pang of guilt. "Everything happened so fast, and I guess I'm still processing it all. I'm fine, I promise." Lisa took a shaky breath. "I'm so proud of you, Kevin, but I'm also furious about how you were treated. Are you sure you're all right?" Kevin reassured her, promising to share all the details when he got home. As he ended the call, he noticed the taxi driver watching him in the rearview mirror with newfound interest. "Wait a minute," the driver said, his eyes widening in recognition. "Are you the pilot from the news? The one who landed that plane?" Kevin nodded reluctantly, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. The driver's face lit up with admiration. "Man, what you did was incredible. My brother-in-law was on that flight. He called us as soon as he landed, couldn't stop talking about how you saved everyone. As they continued the drive, the taxi driver peppered Kevin with questions about the experience. Kevin answered politely but briefly, his mind already racing ahead to what the coming days might bring. When they finally arrived at the hotel, the driver refused to accept payment. "It's an honor to drive a hero," he insisted, shaking Kevin's hand vigorously. Kevin tried to protest, but the driver was adamant. Reluctantly, Kevin accepted the gesture, thanking the man before heading into the hotel. As he approached the reception desk, Kevin noticed the night clerk doing a double-take. The young woman's eyes widened as she recognized him. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice filled with awe. "We've been expecting you. The manager has upgraded you to our best suite, free of charge." Kevin started to decline, but the clerk was already handing him the key card. "Please," she said earnestly, "it's the least we can do after what you've been through." Too tired to argue, Kevin accepted the key with a grateful nod. As he made his way to the elevator, he could hear the clerk whispering excitedly to her colleague. The suite was luxurious, with a stunning view of the city skyline. Kevin stood by the window for a moment, watching the twinkling lights of Newark. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, he had been guiding a plane full of terrified passengers safely to the ground. As he prepared for bed, Kevin's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from Mr. Martinez, the airline's senior operations manager. "Dear Mr. Johnson, I hope this email finds you well after the extraordinary events of today. I wanted to personally inform you that, in light of your heroic actions and the unfortunate incident with our former employee, our CEO would like to meet with you tomorrow morning to discuss how we can make things right. We have also decided to implement your suggestion immediately. Starting next week, we will be rolling out comprehensive diversity and inclusion training for all our staff. Your experience has opened our eyes to the urgent need for change within our organization. Please let me know if you would be available for a meeting at 10 a.m. tomorrow at our corporate headquarters. Once again, thank you for your courage and professionalism. You've not only saved lives but also sparked a much-needed conversation within our company and the industry as a whole. Sincerely, David Martinez, Senior Operations Manager." Kevin read the email twice, a mix of emotions swirling within him. He was glad that the airline was taking concrete steps to address the issue, but he also felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He knew that his actions and words in the coming days could have a significant impact. After sending a brief reply accepting the meeting, Kevin finally crawled into bed. Despite his exhaustion, sleep was elusive. His mind kept replaying the events of the day, Sarah's sneering face, the sudden crisis in the cockpit, the feeling of the plane touching down safely on the runway. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were a jumble of flashing emergency lights, Sarah's tearful face as she was led away, and the odd expressions of the passengers as they thanked him. The next morning, Kevin awoke to the sound of his phone ringing. It was Lisa again, calling to check on him and to let him know that their children had seen him on the morning news. "They're so proud, Kevin," Lisa said, her voice warm. "Especially Maya." She kept saying, "That's my dad. He's a hero." Kevin felt a lump form in his throat. Maya, their 10-year-old daughter, had recently experienced racial bullying at school. He and Lisa had struggled to help her navigate the complex emotions that came with facing discrimination at such a young age. "Tell them I love them," Kevin said softly. "And Lisa, thank you for always believing in me." After a quick shower and breakfast, Kevin made his way to the airline's corporate headquarters. As he entered the lobby, he was immediately struck by the hushed whispers and admiring glances from the employees. A young intern approached him, her eyes shining with admiration. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to escort you to the meeting room. It's such an honor to meet you, sir. What you did yesterday, it was amazing." Kevin smiled kindly at her enthusiasm. "Thank you," he said simply, following her to the elevator. The meeting room was on the top floor, with a panoramic view of the airport in the distance. As Kevin entered, he found himself face to face with a group of executives, including Mr. Martinez and a distinguished-looking woman he assumed was the CEO. The woman stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Amanda Reeves, CEO of the airline. Thank you so much for coming. What you did yesterday was nothing short of extraordinary. Kevin shook her hand firmly. "Thank you, Ms. Reeves. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." As they all took their seats, Kevin couldn't help but notice that he was the only person of color in the room. It was a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done in corporate America. Ms. Reeves began the meeting by once again expressing her gratitude and apologizing for the discrimination Kevin had faced. She then outlined the steps the airline was taking in response to the incident, including the immediate implementation of diversity training and a review of their hiring and promotion practices. "Mr. Johnson," she said, leaning forward, "we would like to offer you a position as our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable as we work to transform our company culture." Kevin was taken aback by the offer. It was a prestigious position, one that could give him a platform to effect real change. But he also knew that it would mean leaving behind his first love, flying. "I'm honored by the offer, Ms. Reeves," he said carefully, "but I'm a pilot at heart. My place is in the cockpit, not the boardroom." Ms. Reeves nodded, looking disappointed but not surprised. "I understand. In that case, we would like to offer you a position as a senior pilot and diversity consultant. You would still fly, but you would also have the opportunity to contribute to our diversity initiatives and mentor younger pilots from underrepresented backgrounds." This offer resonated more with Kevin. It would allow him to continue doing what he loved while also making a difference. "That's certainly something I would be interested in exploring further," he said. As the meeting continued, they discussed the details of the potential role and the broader changes the airline was planning to implement. Kevin shared his own experiences and insights, challenging the executives to think beyond mere training sessions and to consider systemic changes that could create a truly inclusive environment. By the time the meeting concluded, Kevin felt cautiously optimistic. The executives seemed genuinely committed to change, and he believed that his involvement could help ensure that commitment translated into meaningful action. As he left the building, Kevin was surprised to find a small crowd of reporters waiting outside. Word of his meeting with the airline executives had somehow leaked. "Mr. Johnson, can you tell us about your meeting with the airline?" one reporter called out. "Mr. Johnson, how do you feel about the flight attendant who discriminated against you being fired?" another shouted. Kevin paused, realizing that his response could shape the narrative around this incident. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward to address the reporters. "The airline has taken responsibility for what happened and is committed to making significant changes," he began. "As for the flight attendant, while her actions were unacceptable, I hope this incident leads to growth and learning, not just for her, but for all of us." He continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "What happened on that flight is just one example of the discrimination that people of color face every day. But it's also an example of what can happen when we look beyond stereotypes and give everyone the chance to show their true capabilities." The reporters scribbled furiously, hanging on his every word. Kevin could see his impromptu speech being live-streamed on several phones. "My hope is that this incident serves as a wake-up call, not just for one airline, but for our society as a whole. We all have biases, but it's our responsibility to recognize them and work to overcome them. Only then can we create a truly just and equitable world." As Kevin finished speaking, a round of applause broke out from onlookers who had gathered to watch. He nodded appreciatively, then made his way through the crowd, politely declining further questions. As he walked away, Kevin's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Just saw you on TV. You were amazing, honey. So proud of you." Kevin smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the coming days and weeks would be challenging, but he was ready to embrace his new role as both a pilot and an advocate for change. Over the next few months, Kevin's life transformed in ways he never could have anticipated. He accepted the airline's offer, splitting his time between flying and working on diversity initiatives. His story continued to resonate with people around the world, and he found himself being invited to speak at conferences, schools, and corporate events. One particularly memorable moment came when he was asked to give a commencement speech at his alma mater. Standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of eager young faces, Kevin felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "When I was sitting where you are now," he began, "I never imagined that one day I'd be standing here sharing my story with you. I certainly never imagined that I'd become an unwitting symbol in the fight against discrimination." He paused, letting his words sink in. But life has a way of putting us in situations we never expected. The question is, how do we respond when those moments come? Kevin went on to share the story of the flight, not just the dramatic emergency landing, but the subtle, insidious discrimination he had faced beforehand. He spoke about the importance of perseverance, of staying true to one's values even in the face of adversity. "Each of you will face challenges in your lives and careers," he continued. "Some of those challenges may be because of your race, your gender, your religion, or any other aspect of your identity. But remember this: those aspects of yourself that others may see as liabilities are actually your greatest strengths. They give you a unique perspective, a resilience that cannot be taught." As he concluded his speech, Kevin could see tears in the eyes of many students. After the ceremony, a young black woman approached him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I'm studying aerospace engineering, and I've always dreamed of being a pilot. But sometimes it feels like the odds are stacked against me. Hearing your story, it gives me hope." Kevin placed a hand on her shoulder, looking her in the eye. "The skies belong to all of us," he said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If this is your dream, pursue it with everything you have." The young woman nodded, her eyes shining with renewed determination. As she walked away, Kevin felt a profound sense of fulfillment. If his story could inspire even one person to pursue their dreams in the face of adversity, then everything he had been through was worth it. Back at the airline, Kevin's influence was beginning to show results. The diversity training program he helped develop was receiving positive feedback from employees. More importantly, he was seeing a gradual shift in the company culture. People were becoming more aware of their biases and more willing to challenge discriminatory behavior when they saw it. One day, as Kevin was preparing for a flight, he was approached by a familiar face, Alex, the young flight attendant who had been kind to him during the fateful flight. "Captain Johnson," Alex said, a look of determination on his face. "I wanted to thank you. After what happened, well, it made me realize that staying silent in the face of discrimination makes me part of the problem. I've started speaking up when I see unfair treatment, even when it's uncomfortable." Kevin smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "That takes courage, Alex. Keep it up. That's how real change happens, one person at a time, one action at a time." As Kevin settled into the cockpit for his flight, he reflected on how much had changed in the months since that dramatic day. The incident had been a catalyst, not just for his own life, but for a broader conversation about race and discrimination in the airline industry and beyond. He thought about Sarah, the flight attendant who had treated him so poorly. He had heard through the grapevine that she had taken diversity training courses and was working as a customer service representative for another company. He hoped that she had learned from the experience and was working to overcome her biases. As he began the pre-flight checklist, Kevin's co-pilot, a young woman of Middle Eastern descent, turned to him with a grin. "Ready to fly, Captain?" Kevin smiled back, feeling a sense of contentment wash over him. This was where he belonged, in the cockpit, doing what he loved, while also paving the way for others to follow in his footsteps. "Ready as always," he replied, his hands moving confidently over the controls. As the plane taxied down the runway, Kevin felt the familiar thrill of takeoff. But now, that excitement was mixed with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just flying a plane. He was helping to chart a course towards a more inclusive future. The plane lifted off the ground, soaring into the clear blue sky. As the city fell away beneath them, Kevin thought about all the people who had been touched by his story, the passengers on that fateful flight, the young students he had spoken to, his colleagues at the airline. He thought about his daughter, Maya, and how his experience might shape her understanding of the world and her place in it. He hoped that by the time she was grown, stories like his would be relics of the past, that she would live in a world where people were truly judged by the content of their character. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Kevin made an announcement to the passengers, his voice calm and reassuring over the intercom. He could almost feel the collective sense of trust from the passengers, not because of his recent fame, but because of the confidence and professionalism he projected. In that moment, Kevin realized that this was his true legacy. Not the headlines or the speaking engagements, but the everyday actions that chipped away at prejudice and stereotypes. As the years passed, Kevin Johnson's influence continued to grow, both within the airline industry and beyond. His story became a case study in corporate diversity training programs, and his name became synonymous with resilience and breaking barriers. 5 years after the fateful flight that had changed everything, Kevin found himself back at Newark Liberty International Airport. This time, however, he wasn't piloting a plane or giving a speech. He was there to welcome a very special group of young aviators. The airline, under Kevin's guidance, had launched a scholarship program for aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. Today was the day the first cohort of scholarship recipients would be taking their inaugural flight as part of their training. As Kevin stood in the bustling terminal, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The airline staff now reflected a diverse tapestry of races, genders, and backgrounds. More importantly, there was a palpable shift in the company culture. Inclusivity wasn't just a buzzword. It was woven into the fabric of daily operations. A group of excited young faces approached, led by a familiar figure, Alex, the flight attendant who had shown Kevin kindness during that turbulent flight years ago. Alex had since become a key ally in Kevin's diversity initiatives and was now the program coordinator for the scholarship. Captain Johnson, Alex called out, his face beaming with pride. "Allow me to introduce our first class of future pilots." Kevin looked at the group of young people, their eyes shining with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He saw himself in each of them. The dreams, the determination, and yes, the apprehension of entering a field where they might face discrimination. "Welcome, future captains," Kevin said warmly. "I can't tell you how proud I am to see you all here today. Each of you represents not just the future of aviation, but the future of a more inclusive society." As Kevin began to share words of encouragement with the group, he noticed a woman hovering at the edge of the gathering, her eyes fixed on him. It took a moment, but recognition dawned on him. It was Sarah, the flight attendant whose discriminatory behavior had set off the chain of events 5 years ago. Kevin excused himself from the group and approached her. Sarah looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you, Sarah," Kevin said gently. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I've wanted to apologize to you for so long, but I never had the courage. What I did, how I treated you, it was unforgivable." Kevin listened patiently as Sarah poured out her heart. She told him about the soul-searching she had done after losing her job, how she had confronted her own biases and worked hard to change. She was now working as a diversity consultant, using her own story as a cautionary tale to help others recognize and overcome their prejudices. "I don't expect forgiveness," Sarah finished, wiping her eyes. "But I wanted you to know that you changed my life. You opened my eyes, and I'm trying every day to be a better person because of it." Kevin was quiet for a moment, taking in Sarah's words. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. "Sarah, the fact that you're here, that you've worked to change, that's what forgiveness looks like. That's what progress looks like." He gestured to the group of young scholarship recipients. "See those young people over there? They're about to embark on a journey that wouldn't have been possible without what happened that day. Sometimes, our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth." Sarah looked at the diverse group of aspiring pilots, then back at Kevin, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Would it be okay if I spoke to them? Shared my story as a warning about the consequences of prejudice." Kevin nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I think that would be very valuable, Sarah. It takes courage to admit our mistakes, and even more to use them to help others." As they walked back to the group together, Kevin felt a sense of completion. This, he realized, was the true power of forgiveness and growth. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about using it to shape a better future. Kevin introduced Sarah to the group, and as she began to share her story, he saw the young aviators listening intently. He noticed looks of surprise, then understanding, and finally respect on their faces. Sarah's vulnerability and honesty were powerful tools in driving home the importance of recognizing and overcoming bias. After Sarah finished speaking, one of the young scholarship recipients, a Latina woman named Elena, raised her hand. "Miss Sarah, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Hearing both of your stories, it makes me realize the responsibility we have. We're not just here to fly planes. We're here to continue the work you've started, to make sure that nobody faces the kind of discrimination you experienced, Mr. Johnson." Kevin felt a lump form in his throat. "That's exactly right, Elena," he said. "Each of you has the power to shape the future of this industry and our society. Always remember that your actions, no matter how small they might seem, can have a profound impact." As the day went on, Kevin watched with pride as the young aviators began their training flights. He saw Sarah talking with Alex, no doubt sharing ideas on how to further improve the airline's diversity programs. He saw the seasoned pilots and flight attendants going out of their way to make the newcomers feel welcome, regardless of their backgrounds. That evening, as the sun set over the airport, casting a golden glow across the runways, Kevin stood by a window, watching planes take off and land. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "How did it go today, honey?" Kevin smiled as he typed his reply. "Better than I could have ever imagined. I think we've come full circle." As he pocketed his phone, Kevin felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Elena, the young woman who had spoken up earlier. "Captain Johnson," she said, her eyes shining with determination, "I just wanted to thank you again. You know, when I was a little girl, I never saw anyone who looked like me flying planes. But now, because of you, because of this program, I can be that person for the next generation. I promise I won't let you down." Kevin felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "Elena," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "you could never let me down. The fact that you're here, that you're pursuing your dreams despite the obstacles, that's all I could ever ask for." As Elena walked away, Kevin turned back to the window, watching as a plane lifted off into the twilight sky. He thought about all the lives that had been touched, all the changes that had been set in motion because of one difficult day 5 years ago. He thought about Sarah and how her journey of redemption was a testament to the power of confronting one's biases. He thought about Alex and how a small act of kindness had blossomed into a commitment to fighting discrimination. He thought about all the passengers from that fateful flight and how their experience had rippled out into the world, changing perspectives and challenging prejudices. Most of all, he thought about the future, about Elena and her fellow aspiring pilots, and the impact they would have on the industry and the world. About his own children, growing up in a world that was slowly but surely becoming more inclusive and equitable. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Kevin felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He knew that the work was far from over, that there would always be challenges to face and biases to overcome. But he also knew that every small step, every individual choosing to stand up against discrimination, brought them closer to a world where everyone could soar, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Kevin turned away from the window, ready to head home to Lisa and the kids. As he walked through the terminal, he passed by a diverse group of airline staff, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, all working together seamlessly. He saw respect in their interactions, camaraderie in their smiles. This, he realized, was his true legacy. Not the accolades or the speaking engagements, but the cultural shift he had helped to spark. A shift towards a world where people were judged not by their appearance, but by their character and capabilities. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, Kevin took a deep breath, feeling the same exhilaration he always felt before a flight. But this wasn't just the excitement of a journey by air. This was the thrill of a much greater voyage, the ongoing journey towards equality and justice. With a smile on his face and hope in his heart, Kevin headed home, ready for whatever new adventures tomorrow might bring. He knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, to challenge their own biases and those of others, the sky was truly the limit. Kevin's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't just about what you do in the spotlight, but how you handle yourself when no one believes in you. What would you have done in Kevin's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more powerful and uplifting stories like this one.